they can take over a device, read every email, every text message, even those that are encrypted, turn on the camera, turn on the microphone, follow people around, go back in time, see where they've been as long as that phone's been activated, who they've been communicated. This is godlike capabilities, and I suspect judges don't quite understand what they're giving permission for.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Ron, I want to start at the beginning with you. So many questions, and we'll definitely want to leave room for audience questions. But in this book, you recount incredible, breathtaking stories about the work that Citizen Lab and you have undertaken over the last couple of decades. But it's also in part a memoir of sorts. I wonder if you could tell us where your interest in the field of cybersecurity actually began. You, Ron, not the Citizen Lab, but
not
you.
Me. Well, there's a kind of funny origin story, actually. I tell a bit about it in the book, where I was starting my PhD, which I did at the University of British Columbia. And at that time, I was very headstrong, determined to be a Sovietologist. I was really into Soviet foreign policy. I was teaching myself Russian. I was interested in military and strategic affairs globally. And I applied to the program. I got in. I went to see the professor at the University of British Columbia, who was the Sovietologist in the department, Paul Morantz. And I'll never forget the meeting. I went in. I'm like, well, what I'd like to do is specialize in this, obscure area of Kremlinology. And he said, Ron, the Berlin Wall has just collapsed. I think you better find a new area to study. And I was completely devastated. It was like my entire reason for being had been. So I took a day to grieve about it. And then I went to see another professor, Mark Zacher, who is no longer with us, passed away a while ago, and is one of my favorite people on earth. And I sat down with him, and he had a sharp eye for interesting topics. And he said to me, no one's looking at, the way he phrased it was the telecommunications revolution and its impact on international security. And this really grabbed me because I was very interested in technology. In fact, as part of the Soviet stuff that I was doing, I was very interested in espionage and signals intelligence. And I thought about it for a minute. This was at a time, by the way, when I entered that department, I remember going to the office and saying, can I get an email? And they didn't know what I was talking about.
What an email was.
And none of the faculty, except maybe one, quant nerd, mathematics type guy, had a computer. The rest didn't even have computers. That was 1990. Within 4 years, all of the professors had not only computers, but internet connections. Right. So it was profoundly great suggestion from Mark.
So that professor obviously knew a little bit about you to suggest that, in addition to knowing about the field. But could you speak to the character or the quality of your character, that would have determined your interest, not just in Sovietology and espionage and that kind of thing, but also in this technological revolution that was happening at the time?
Well, it was obvious to me anyway that there were profound things happening. And for those of you in the audience, looking out in the audience, I can tell a lot of people will remember that this was a time when it was so stunning. Things were happening so fast. And people drew very simple causal arrows. They said, more information, more technology. We're going to bypass all of the intermediaries, all the traditional broadcasters. We're going to be able to speak to each other one-on-one. And I remember experiencing that, being able to chat with somebody on the other side of the planet and think, this is revolutionary. This is profoundly cool. So most people assume there'd be vast liberatory consequences of all of this. But I had come at the topic from a security background. I had some experience that I write about in the book. I was seconded to Foreign Affairs Canada for a while to do some studies on the use of satellite reconnaissance for arms control. So I became familiar with the whole spook world, let's call it, and I realized there was a lot of classified stuff going on. Governments were very adept at tapping telecommunications networks. So I was looking at this a bit skeptical. I was thinking maybe there's more to the story than people are letting on. If everyone's connected to these computers and sharing all their intimate details, what's to stop people from eavesdropping and looking at the other side of it? And that's kind of how I approach the subject. Yeah.
Just jumping right ahead to the founding of the Citizen Lab, how hard a sell was it to found the actual lab?
Well, I again, there was really fortunate. I got a call out of the blue from a program officer at the Ford Foundation, whose name at the time was Anthony Romero, still is. Anthony Romero is the president of the American Civil Liberties Union now. Back then, he was a program officer at the Ford Foundation. And Ford Foundation has this history of field building in academia. They try to identify topics which they think are important over the horizon, and then find researchers and try to spur on research in that area. And they were wanting to do this around information technology and international security, and he had identified me out of the blue. So I got this call to go to New York, and originally they wanted to hire me as a program officer. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to give other people grant money. I wanted grant money for myself to do my own thing. So he said, okay, write up a proposal. And I literally wrote up the proposal for the Citizen Lab. And it was pretty audacious. I still have the proposal, actually. And in it, I explain my vision, which was to create an interdisciplinary lab, to bring together researchers, especially who had technical skills that I didn't necessarily have all that well, and perform what I described as counterintelligence for civil society. So the idea there was governments are doing counterintelligence and intelligence, businesses are even doing it, but who's watching out for journalists? Who's watching out for human rights activists, for NGOs out there? Yeah. And that's the proposal I put forward, and to my shock, they agreed to do it. Within the University of Toronto, I don't think anyone really noticed until suddenly we were splashed on the newspapers after a few years, and then it's too late for them to shut it down.
Is there any sense in which you think that the story of the Citizen Lab was ever going to unfold anywhere but Canada?
Back then, I wasn't thinking that way. Again, it was all just aspirational, and I didn't really know what will this amount to other than a couple of years of work. But in hindsight now, definitely it's obvious to me now more than ever that you couldn't do something like this outside of Canada. There was a period of time when I was really advocating for there to be more citizen labs around the world, and I was going around proselytizing and actually trying to help set up a few institutes and centers that were modeled on the Citizen Lab, and it didn't take hold in a lot of places. Yeah. And I think it's clearly because of the phenomenon is so risky. Yeah. And within the University of Toronto, I will say this, all joking aside, I've never once had anybody in administration, from the president on down, ever say to me, can you tone it down a little bit? Or maybe you don't want to alienate that country because we have a lot of students. Yeah. Never have I heard that from them.
I'd be curious what you did hear when, maybe I'll just back up and say that the first time our worlds intersected was when, in fact, you were looking at Canadian companies specifically. Yes. And you were looking at their ability to sell technology to countries around the world that would filter technology, censor political criticism, and also undesirable topics online. And I just wonder, as a Canadian, how that sat with you, knowing that there are Canadian companies selling technology around the world that censored political opponents of autocratic regimes.
Well, it didn't sit with me well at all, but I think it was also important to establish that we would identify Canadian companies or call out the Canadian government. To this day, I think that's still very important, because people assume, oh, you're a Canadian organization, you're probably going to shy away from calling things out in your home territory, when in fact we've never been shy about doing that. And in that case, that was NetSweeper, I think you're referring to.
Correct, yeah.
Canadian company that supplies internet censorship technology or internet filtering technology. They use a more anodyne way of describing what they do, which is basically just blocking access to websites. So there's a benign version of that. You don't want, for example, maybe in library settings, you don't want people viewing certain websites, I don't know, or in elementary schools, certainly. So that company started out servicing that market, and then they quickly realized there's a market also within non-democratic countries for that technology, not within private settings or in a library or a school, but for a country as a whole. So
Everywhere from India to Yemen to...
all over the place. I think we ended up, dozens of countries were using, internet service providers in those countries were using NetSweeper's technology to filter access to LGBTQ content, to human rights content, whatever. And, you know, this company was just trucking along doing this, making good money. And we developed a way to actually interrogate the internet using network measurement techniques to identify NetSweeper installations. And of course, when we first encountered each other, I think it was around the time, shortly afterwards, they sued myself and the University of Toronto. $3.5 million
lawsuit. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was maybe the first, but not the last time that's happened to me. And during the course of that whole process, of course, there are many lawyers involved, and we couldn't publish anything about NetSweeper in the time that litigation was happening, but we could do research. And so I had this idea, we're going to map every NetSweeper installation in the world, and as soon as this litigation is over, we're going to publish this. And that was Planet NetSweeper. So revenge through research, I guess you call it.
Revenge through research.
Yeah.
You talk about Citizen Lab being counterintelligence for civil society. In your mission, you say that at the Citizen Lab, our quote unquote, quote, open quote, our mission is to serve the public interest, not subvert it. And then, as you say, you're counterintelligence for civil society. Isn't that the government's job?
Yeah, in part it is. I think it should be. But the reality is the way governments are constituted, especially, you know, we have a whole segment of the world's governments that are dictators, despots, authoritarian regimes, and most of the world is sliding in that direction. But even within liberal democracies, the priority has always been around, for example, if you're interested in cybersecurity, which is obviously a topic that relates to this, if you listen to governments, when they talk about it, it's mostly to do with attacks on government infrastructure or attacks on the private sector. So when it comes to all of these other, you know, refugees, immigrants, support groups, NGOs, journalists, they're kind of hung out to dry, and that's a problem as far as I'm concerned. So we try to raise awareness about it through the research and hopefully come up with ways that prompt governments to do something about it. And we're not an advocacy group, we're purely an investigatory group, but always we have recommendations in our reports. Government should be doing more of X, Y, and Z, in our opinion, to mitigate this problem.
How often do they actually listen?
Actually, surprisingly, I tell the story in the book about President Biden signing an executive order that we were instrumental in bringing about, along with a number of other organizations. I briefed the White House National Security Council, and when that executive order came out, essentially it prohibits U.S. federal agencies from procuring spyware, which is principally what the book is about, the mercenary spyware market, prohibits those federal agencies from procuring that technology from firms that are involved in human rights abuses. I couldn't have written that executive order better myself. So, you know, as a political scientist, I'll say when a president of the United States signs an executive order, that's kind of like winning the Holy Grail. So, you know, in that case, they listened. In a lot of other cases, they don't, for whatever reason. They're different equities, there are different stakeholders that have different views of things.
Yeah. There was a time when you actually thought about the mission of the Citizen Lab as more technical in nature. You say as part of a global observation network dedicated to documenting threats to a free and secure internet. But that changed completely when you went on a trip to Guatemala. Post-war Guatemala in the early 2000s. And I wonder, it was after 36 years of civil war in Guatemala, and I wonder if you could explain what it is that you learned there that reshaped your thinking about the mission that you were conducting.
Yeah, that's actually my favorite chapter of the book, because it was such a formative experience for me and some of my staff at the time. And you're right, we did conceive of what we're doing as like, I was deliberately thinking of the lab's approach to doing research as borrowing from state intelligence agencies, and especially the technical side. And it's kind of metaphorical, it's kind of not. The idea was, okay, we're going to watch the watchers and use a variety of technical methods to lift the lid on the internet. And so in my mind, I was thinking just of this leveraging technical means to do the work that we do, snooping on the governments and so forth. But when I was in Guatemala, it dawned on me, principally meeting the people who were working for the human rights organizations, especially folks who are doing forensic examinations for war crimes investigations and genocide investigations. The threats they experienced on a daily basis were profound, very disturbing, very frightening. And at the same time, the internet wasn't a big issue then. It wasn't like they were dependent on it, and it wasn't the principal vector through which threats were coming at the people. So, you don't, to put it crudely, you don't need to spy on someone's email when you can break into their headquarters, beat them up, and take all the files. And so meeting these people and understanding their experiences really made me think about the importance of the lab being a victim-centric organization, is the way we thought about it, putting humans first. And the technical part is still, it gets a lot of the attention for what we do for good reason. Some incredibly talented forensic experts and technical experts at the lab, but the human dimension is the most important of what we do.
So a victim-centered organization, or centric organization, but not activist.
Not activist, no.
Can you just tease out the difference?
The reason I say not activist is that often gets a bad name, especially for those who are not necessarily sympathetic to what you're doing, and they're looking for ways to discredit you. So if you say you're an activist organization, and I'm not putting down activists, maybe in different life I would be one, and in different...
And I'm not either, to be clear.
Yeah. It's more that if you say it that way, then people will look upon the research as somehow tainted or biased. And it's very important in this area to have evidence first and put the evidence first. So if you read a typical Citizen Lab report, they're actually very dry. It's not like the book.
I can attest to that, actually.
You can attest to that.
I can attest to it, yeah.
But they're that way for a reason. They have to be very clinical. They have to be very precise. Every word is carefully measured. And of course, we work with a lot of advocacy and activist organizations with whom we collaborate regularly, and they do excellent work. Amnesty International, Access Now, Human Rights Watch, those are all part of our community. But we see our role as kind of like an intelligence agency for a state. You wouldn't have a state coming in and say, well, I think we should do this, like the intelligence agencies have a role to just present the evidence. Here's what we are seeing. And there are profound public ramifications of the work that we do. The most important, I would say, the most satisfying to me have been the number of times we've actually captured these very expensive, sophisticated exploits that are used to hack into people's phones that the manufacturers of the phones aren't aware of.
Right.
We do these responsible disclosures. They do emergency security patches, and that affects, everyone in this room. It affects billions of people, their practical security.
But speaking of activists, they are often the ones who come to you
100%.
with these tips. You
Yeah.
know, journalists and activists.
And they're the subjects of the research.
and they are the
often.
subjects,
Yeah.
which we'll get to in a minute. But
Yeah.
could you talk about what happens? Like, let's say I give you a call and say, hey, there's something weird happening with my
Mm-hmm.
phone. Where does the process, how does it unfold from there?
So this is the fun part for me. I'm glad you asked that. So first of all, we have again, being a university-based research group, we have to follow strict research ethics protocols. This is something that may not be apparent to people who observe the Citizen Lab from the outside, or maybe not part of a university, but we undergo very strict and pretty rigorous peer review of everything we do, right down to the methodologies. We have to present this to a committee, they look at it, they give us feedback, and then when it comes to dealing with victims, we'll call human subjects in research, it's very similar to like if you went to a university medical research center and enrolled or a psychology program. You have to be read through an informed consent process. So the first thing I do is walk you through the consent process, which takes a few minutes. I'm explaining to you the type of data that you're going to share with me. And typically what we do is, like I see you have an iPhone there, we would get a crash log from that phone. Is it an iPhone or is it?
It is an
Android?
iPhone,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
And I would ask you to generate a crash log.
What's a crash log, sorry?
Like it's, if you ever have something crash on your device and it says, would you like to send this bug report to Apple or
So
whatever?
that's what that's for.
I walk you through a few steps on how to generate that yourself. So it's a file that has all of these processes that are going on behind the scenes in your phone. And then I send them to my team and we analyze them. And what we are looking for are either anomalies or, more importantly, matches with fingerprints that we've developed and maintained for some of the world's most notorious mercenary spyware firms. I've been doing that sort of thing hundreds, maybe thousands of times now, and it's actually the best part of the job. We've set up spyware checking booths, for example. Recently I did one at the Global Investigative Journalism Conference, and there's like 2,000 investigative journalists there. That's a perfect spot for us to do this because there's likely going to be at least somebody there whose phone has been hacked. So when you do that analysis, and usually we can give results back in like half an hour, sometimes you tell people, like, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your phone has been under surveillance.
Sometimes that process of actually coming back with the results to someone is also fraught security-wise. Like actually reporting
Yes.
back to an activist in another country is not as straightforward as it sounds. What does that say about our means of communication in this time? Like just how trustworthy they are?
It's almost like a paradox
Yeah.
around all of this because you're, especially if you're not with somebody physically, if you're connecting with them remote, you have to first figure out how to get them off that device that you think is under surveillance. That's very tricky. Of course, people's first instinct is to delete everything. If they get for example, WhatsApp, Apple, a number of other companies have started sending out notifications to people when they discover that their customers' phones have been hacked.
Yeah.
This is going on as we speak. People freak out quite naturally, like, what the heck? You know, and they delete their phone. For us, that's bad, though, as investigators. You want to preserve the evidence and make sure that you deal with it in a way, especially because you want, ultimately, some of these victims may want to sue the companies, sue a foreign government that's hacking their phone. So you have to make sure you have a proper chain of custody around it all. There's quite a lot involved in that part of it.
One of those activists who came to you is a poet, a blogger, and an activist, an Emirati one. His name is Ahmed Mansour, who...
You knew him, right?
What's that?
You met him.
I
didn't
did
you?
never met him, but
Oh,
we
but
did,
you did
we
a
did
story
a
on-
story,
yeah,
and we
okay.
used your
Yeah.
Planet Netsweeper
Right.
report about it.
Yeah.
We don't have enough time tonight to go through it, but it is in the book. It's a riveting story, so that's a good reason to pick it up. But I do want to ask you this. You called him... He alerted you to a vulnerability that literally affected every iPhone in the world.
Yeah.
And several organizations, including yours, remind us repeatedly of how he saved our security and prevented our data from being exposed. He is still in a jail in the UAE today, and I wondered.
Horrible.
Yeah, and I would venture to say that most Canadians could not name him. How does that sit with you as the head of Citizen Lab and someone who works in this field, that someone who's so pivotal to all our security is unknown and still languishing in prison?
Yeah, it's I mean, I'm not sure how I feel about it. I mean, I can understand why he's not a household name, and actually there are many more like him. Another one that comes to mind actually for this audience, because we're in Canada, Loujain al-Hatoul. Very similar. This is several years, 6 years after Ahmad Mansour is the person you're speaking about. Same thing. We discovered her phone was hacked with Pegasus spyware, and that was a vulnerability that was affecting all Apple devices. And at first, she requested to remain anonymous, going back to the research ethics part of it. If a victim says, I don't want to be identified, we have to respect that. Yeah. She did at first. Again, that affected every Apple user around, and not just iPhones, Mac OS, iPads, everything. She was, maybe you know, famous for being a woman's rights activist, advocating for a woman to be able to drive a car without a chaperone in Saudi Arabia. For that activism, which just obviously seems like such a basic right, it's crazy that there would have to be someone advocating for that at all, but that was her cause. Because of that, she was harassed, detained, imprisoned, horribly tortured. I spent hours interviewing her about her experiences, and to this day, she's under country arrest in Saudi Arabia. Not as bad as Ahmad Mansour, who is in a horrible prison in the UAE, and from all that I've heard, which is very little because not a lot of news gets out, he's routinely tortured. So that, you know, it's a side of the work that we do that doesn't get a lot of attention, but I'm certainly aware. I'm acutely aware of it because I deal one-on-one with a lot of these people, and you hear these stories. What it does for me, I will say, is it makes me angry, but it also makes me more determined than ever to keep doing what we're doing. Because what I see behind all of that are bullies. And I think, you know, getting back to what started the Citizen Lab, and this goes even before what drives me to do what I do, I realize, I have a problem with authority. I went to a Catholic elementary school in East Vancouver, and I got the strap a few times, and so I guess I should thank the nuns in part. But also, I just can't stand bullies. I just don't like people who are bullies, and especially bullies who get away with stuff. And when I look at Mohammed bin Salman, and of course, you know, the person, we'll get to it, I'm sure.
We will.
These are bullies.
Yeah.
These are just bullies, and they shouldn't be allowed to do what they do. So I have a platform. I have tenure at a prestigious university, amazing team around me. When I think about, well, what can I do to stop it? It's exposing what they're doing, outing them, and I'm sure it pisses them off. Well, I know it does. Yeah.
I wanted to sort of zoom out a little bit before we continue talking about bullies, which we will, and just take you back in time a little bit, and to a time when we thought that social media might actually be a convening influence on society. It had a far more promising future. It was supposed to be a force of good, providing kind of an address for freedom of speech and liberty. In your book, you quote an Israeli intelligence officer saying that social media allows you to reach virtually anyone and to play with their minds. You could do whatever you want. You can be whoever you want. It's a place where wars are fought, elections are won, and terror is promoted. There are no regulations. It is a no man's land. Was the exploitation of social media in some sense inevitable?
100%. I mean, if you just looking at how it's set up, and especially the business model of surveillance capitalism, basically, you know, every aspect of social media and a lot of the technology that surrounds us even outside of social media is oriented around gathering up as much information from customers as possible in order to target them with advertisements. Anybody who works for any state intelligence agency worth its salt would look at that and go, oh, yes, let's get going. What can we do? And how do we exploit this? You have a infrastructure that's invasive by design, insecure. Security is an afterthought. Zuckerberg had that phrase, move fast and break things. So data breaches are common. All of this is just perfect for the exploitation around cyber espionage, but also increasingly disinformation and psychological operations, influence operations, all of those things. It's now we're living in some dystopian world that is almost like if you're in a laboratory setting and you try to come up with something perfect for that would be a vehicle for it, you couldn't imagine something better. That's not that it's a conspiracy or anything like that. I remember The Onion, the satirical website,
Yes.
had something way back where it was ostensibly a CIA person testifying before the Senate, saying, "Yes, we couldn't believe we created this thing called Facebook, and people are telling us what they ate for breakfast and where they are, and all of this is the perfect vehicle."
Yeah.
And it's true.
Yeah. I've always been curious, though, about what you think, whether you've just sort of described the difficulty of resisting using such technology, which is so revelatory because people use it so intimately. But is it the technology? Is it a function of the technology that we're in this space that we're in now? Or did it just exasperate something that was already in us? Kind of this inevitable collapse of the common good or the
Yeah.
triumph of individualism. I mean,
Yeah.
is it us or is it the technology?
Well, I think stepping back, maybe a lot of this would have been inevitable simply because of the intensity of interactions with people and information exchanges. I remember the internet before social media, and it was constructed differently. I think social media is important because of the underlying business model. This idea of turning users into raw material from which you can extract data, monitor everything they do, give things away apparently for free when in fact you're just constantly, you're the livestock for their data farms, basically. That whole business model has thoroughly perverted the public sphere, and I think is responsible for a lot of the problems we see, some of the toxic mess that is out there. If we could get rid of that business model, I don't think it's really easy. It's not likely going to happen anytime soon. But I think it's the root of a lot of the problems that we're seeing around social media, for sure.
So staying with kind of the same theme, there are a couple of ways that we make ourselves or we become vulnerable to the problems that you talk about in this book. One is self-inflicted because, as you say, we willingly give out this data online. And the other is damage performed against us by those who might want to attack us for our political beliefs or other beliefs. So starting with the self-inflicted problem, what have we done wrong? And do we actually have any agency to reverse it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think it's fair to blame people for what's going on because keep in mind that this is highly addictive technology. It's designed to play upon your emotions and to tap into human frailties and cognitive biases. And the way it's done through most of those social media platforms is really just simple A/B experiments on the scale of billions of people. Yeah. So if you imagine you control a system, and the machines are all doing this, of course, and it's like, let's put this content in front of somebody. Do they keep engaged? Does it excite them? Can we look at their retinas and see if this really gets them activated? Or does this content do it better? If you keep doing that simple A/B experiment, unfortunately, human nature being what it is, the crap rises to the surface. And that's why you see what you see on X and on Facebook and so forth. Now, there was a period of time starting around 2016, first Donald Trump election, and then certainly with the pandemic, where the companies were required to put some brakes on that. Everyone kind of recognized, oh, this is a problem, and they all made this attempt to create trust and safety teams, and I know some of the people who worked for them. Whether they were successful or not, I would say it's a jury's still out on that. But what I can say now is that the brakes are all off. It's all gas. Those companies laid off their trust and safety teams, which is going to amplify all of the problems that we're discussing. But more importantly, for me anyway, it's going to really accelerate a lot of the more, the sharper harms that we see around targeted espionage. Because those companies did have programs in place to protect people or collaborate with groups like ours. It seems strange that the Citizen Lab might collaborate with WhatsApp or Facebook even, or Apple. I should say we don't take money from any of those companies, and we're very critical of them, as you can hear from me. But there are times, pragmatically, when you have to work with those teams on patching vulnerabilities or encouraging them to take steps to investigate threats are moving through their platforms.
Just on that point, generally, how receptive are those organizations to your, well-researched criticisms or, suggestions for fixes?
It depends. So the big companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, etc., you can't characterize them in monolithic ways because they're very big. They're more like governments, and they have many different departments. And within those companies, there are threat intelligence teams, such that they exist any longer. Most of them still have remnants of it. And those people actually, they could easily work for the Citizen Lab. And in fact, some people who've worked for those companies have come to work for me because they appreciate the mission. They can do public good research, and they're very talented researchers. So it's a very professional, cordial, respectful kind of back and forth. We are, the disclosures we talked about before, that's very important to them, because if we're finding out about some exploit that is targeting all iPhone users and we disclose it to them and they patch that, that's good for Apple. They don't want that going around. So they're motivated to do something about it. In Ahmad Mansour's case in 2016, I can remember he sent us text messages August 11th. We analyzed them. We wrote up a report, did a responsible disclosure to Apple. August 28th, our report came out, and Apple issued emergency security patches for all Apple users. Yeah. That's like 2 weeks, so very fast.
Wow. Yeah, that's profound. Yeah. One of the groups that you talk about at length, both in public and in your book, is the Israel-based group, NSO group.
Never heard of them.
You write, this is a bit of a paragraph, but let me read it. You write that the group is like a microcosm of the world in which we now live. Unprincipled billionaires dodging taxes and regulatory oversight, looking to cash in on the national security money-making machine, mercenary companies employing highly trained software vulnerability hunters to exploit fissures in the always-on invasive, I can go on here, authoritarians and kleptocrats ruthlessly maneuvering to undermine anything or anyone who might get in their way, and assassins who will slip a nerve agent into your tea at your London hotel, the coup de grace. You do point out that it's one of many. There are other organizations, but what is it about NCO in particular? What is it about NSO in particular that makes them a symbol of how things have kind of gone wrong in the way we handle or regulate certain kinds of technology?
NSO is not that unique in terms of what they do. So they sell a very sophisticated mercenary spyware product called Pegasus that is marketed to government clients around the world. And that type of spyware is extremely powerful. So the latest versions can be implanted on anyone's device anywhere in the world. And as we speak, there is literally no defense against it. If we're lucky, we can catch that in the wild, as I've talked about, and do a quick disclosure to one of the companies, and they'll patch it. But those companies then, the firms like NSO Group, they just turn around and they develop or purchase new exploits, which are basically flaws in the phones that you are all dependent on. The most recent versions are known as zero-click. So with Ahmad Mansour, he sent us text messages, and he didn't click on them. But we could see from the text message that it contained domains that we knew were associated with NSO Group's infrastructure, and we actually clicked on those links in the laboratory setting, infected our own device. In order to implant the spyware, you'd have to trick somebody into doing something like that, clicking on a link, opening an attachment. The latest versions require nothing of that. So one minute your phone's seemingly fine, it's on your bedside table, the next it's not fine. And it's funneling data to a bunker in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, thanks to companies like NSO Group. The reason they're special, I think, is they made a strategic choice after the Ahmad Mansour report. So that was 2016. Prior to that, they were pretty much invisible. They never spoke to the media. They didn't have a website. They sold their stuff at military and intelligence trade shows that are not open to the public. But when we published our report about them, they decided we're going to speak to the media. And they tried to defend what they were doing. And they're quite notorious for that reason. The rationale they give for their technology and the services they provide is we only sell to governments to enable them to fight serious matters of crime or terrorism. As I always say, as a political science instructor, any first-year political science student would see through that and identify the problem right away. For most of the governments around the world, you're a criminal. I'm a terrorist. Loujain al-Hatul's a criminal. Ahmad Mansour's a terrorist. It's all arbitrary. So if there are no safeguards, governments are going to use this, as we have shown in report after report, to go after anyone they consider irritants to their illegitimate rule.
And is that kind of setting the tone for future companies to act in the same way? Like what kind of precedent is NSO Group setting for people in the area?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
So they've faced pretty serious consequences because of the spotlight on them. They were subjected to U.S. sanctions, both company sanctions and I believe individual sanctions, although those aren't publicized. We do know the United States sanctioned individuals involved in this marketplace probably included principals of that company. They just don't publicize them. And so their market value dropped by about $1 billion after they were put on the sanctions list, and I'm sure that upset them greatly. But other companies, I think, probably took the opposite lesson. They said, okay, NSO speaking up, getting caught, getting exposed, that's bad for our business, let's do it differently. And actually, as we speak, just last week we published a report on yet another mercenary spyware firm, yet another one with Israeli origins called Paragon.
And with a Canadian connection this time.
There's a Canadian connection too. They were marketing themselves as being the anti-NSO group. We're a clean spyware company. We're abuse-proof. We vet our clients very closely. Well, lo and behold, we discovered that their technology was being used in Italy to spy on a journalist, migrant support groups, and a priest in Italy, which I thought was very interesting. Who would want to spy on a priest and why? Think about the confessional. That's what I was saying. When you want to get inside a priest's phone, when the priest is in confessional and hear all.
And a quick comment on just where the Canadian connection is?
Yeah, the Canadian connection, as we were doing the research, we discovered through really ingenious work by Bill Marzak, who's our lead technical researcher, that we identified some IP addresses that mainline right back to the Ontario Provincial Police Headquarters. And so that was interesting. As an aside, I'm well aware that police forces in this country use this technology. We had not been able to find any documented evidence of abuse, but through court records that have come to light, through disclosures that have happened, it's obvious that we have a big spyware abuse problem in this country. I don't want to freak people out because I hope that law enforcement in this country is mostly doing this within the guardrails, but a couple of things make me a bit concerned. One is we've got a long history of abuse of law enforcement in this country. Look at the history of the RCMP and Indigenous communities in this country. Enough said. Secondly, who's watching them? Are we confident in oversight in this country? We have very good privacy commissioners, but I'm not sure they're staffed all that well as they should be, in my opinion. And oversight bodies in Parliament, I don't think are all that well structured or necessarily competent enough to keep watch on what these agencies are doing. And they also have their own curious acronym I discovered they're using for spyware. They didn't call it spyware, they call it on-device interception tools, ODITs.
Okay.
So if they go to a judge, well, we'd like a warrant. What are you going to do? Well, we're going to use something called an ODIT. And the judge might go, okay, that's fine, without knowing that that ODIT means they can take over a device, read every email, every text message, even those that are encrypted, turn on the camera, turn on the microphone, follow people around, go back in time, see where they've been, as long as that phone's been activated, who they've been communicated. This is godlike capabilities, and I suspect judges don't quite understand what they're giving permission for.
So the Citizen Labs still has a bright future ahead for the coming years. Lots of work to do
As
still.
long as we exist, yeah.
We want to get soon to audience questions, but I have a few more just to land this interview. And I do want to stay with Canada for a moment and talk about a past example. The story of Omar Abdulaziz. His phone was hacked, and it was understood to be by Saudi Arabian forces. You were surprised that in Canada, quote, not one of the exchanges I received in my access to information request regarding this case expressed alarm or indignation that Saudi Arabia was spying on a Canadian permanent resident. It was as if that part was ignored altogether. Mm-hmm. Is there something in modern geopolitics, do you think, that renders states unable to take a principled stand on something like this?
Yes, especially in cases like this. Canada, actually at the time we did that, this is 2018, we uncovered the fact that Saudi Arabia had hacked this Canadian permanent resident's phone, who turned out, by the way, to be a very close friend of Jamal Khashoggi. And we know what happened to him.
Who was killed in an embassy in Turkey.
The day after our report was published. And I only found out that Omar and Jamal were friends because, as I tell in the book, we published our report on Omar October 1st. The next morning he said, Jamal has gone missing, I'm very afraid. I was like, who's Jamal? I had no idea. And then I turned on the news and I saw, oh my God, they had been communicating for months over WhatsApp, thinking it was private, doing all sorts of pro-democracy activism and advocating against Mohammed bin Salman. The whole time we discovered Saudi Arabia was eavesdropping. And I should say, subsequently, both Citizen Lab and Amnesty International determined that the entire inner circle around Jamal Khashoggi, all of them had their phones hacked with Pegasus spyware. But the remarks you're talking about had to do with the reaction of the Canadian government. Mm-hmm. I actually did an access to information request to see what type of communications were happening behind the scenes. And it was surprising how little, it seemed to me, relevant stakeholders in government were concerned about the fact that Saudi Arabia was undertaking espionage on a Canadian permanent resident. It was all about kind of damage control. And I think at the time it had to do with Canada's relationship with Saudi Arabia and arms exports to Saudi Arabia. Those are the type of calculations that usually happen all the time in international affairs. Human rights typically takes a back seat. Yeah. You know, I've been advocating throughout my entire professional life for human security. To quote our former Foreign Affairs Minister, Lloyd Axworthy, which I think is a very noble idea, but national security trumps human security. We see it time and again. And I think it's the same as why wouldn't Canada and other countries condemn Israel for a lot of the things that are going on, or this industry. And I think it's the same thing there. There's a lot of...
So is it perhaps the case that maybe, national interest in trade, for example, trump kind of moral considerations?
Of course they do. Yeah, there are considerations about that all the time that are factored into these decisions.
You write that it's, quote, it's conventional to divide the world into regime types, authoritarian versus democratic, for example. But and this is a specific example, but I think we can draw it out to kind of broaden the argument. You say the extensive involvement of the U.S. and Israeli personnel in the United Arab Emirates demonstrates how questionable those divisions between authoritarian and democratic can be. That's a chilling proposition. How much do you think what democracies do in the name of security threats actually contributes to the erosion of democracy?
Well, I think a lot. I think there is a vestige from the Cold War that still lingers on, which is that you have these very well-resourced intelligence agencies that operated in the shadows. And in most countries around the world, they still have that luxury of doing what they do without public oversight, without accountability, without transparency. Sure, there's some oversight mechanisms here and there, but generally they're pretty weak to largely absent. And these agencies actually, they do some important work. I don't want to disparage them all, but they also do some nasty stuff. And that nasty stuff normalizes. It starts to spread and everyone starts doing it. And of course, the big problem now is that you have many countries that are on paper liberal democracies sliding into authoritarianism. Crisis in the U.S. is the most poignant example right now. It's some kind of cruel techno-fascism that's emerging down there. But even, when I wrote those words, I was thinking about the contrast between how I was taught as a graduate student studying world politics and international relations. It's very conventional to have these categories, like there are these type of states and these type of states. Mm-hmm. And what I was looking at didn't match that. It was like, you have these contractors coming from these agencies, CIA, NSA, whatever, working for authoritarian regimes. How does that align with that picture? It muddies the waters altogether.
I just got the nod that we have just a few minutes left before we go to audience questions. So quick couple of questions for me left. There are state actors who say out loud all the time, as you said, that they are the ones in danger of being subverted, and that's why they need these tools of surveillance that they deploy. Is that convincing in any sense for you?
Yeah, I can kind of see the argument. I think it has some merit. There are people in my community that think the tools that I'm describing should be banned altogether, that there shouldn't be this capability out there. It's like the nuclear capability of surveillance. And a lot of people that I respect say we should ban. There's no way that this could be deployed in a way that isn't a violation of international human rights law. I'm more practically minded about it. I think that's not realistic. I don't think we could ever ban it. So instead, I think if governments are going to use this, we need to make sure people are watching them. Yeah. And that's the key to me, is to have guardrails in place that involve independent agencies from both above and below. What the Citizen Lab does is from below. Imagine if there was a Citizen Lab in every country doing this sort of thing, and you had oversight bodies that were really robust and could actually inspect what's going on. I think there would be far less harm from this industry, and maybe they would use it in ways that it's advertised.
As we've discussed, Ron, your Citizen Lab, your career has kind of unfolded along with geopolitical events. First, you were focused on China, then you shifted to the Middle East with the Arab Spring. I'm wondering how you think the change down south, you use the words techno-fascist. I'll describe it as this newfound synergy between the world's biggest democracy and big tech. How does that affect the work of the Citizen Lab going forward?
Well, earlier this month, I was asked to brief members and staff of the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and that is typically the type of thing that's a big honor, and I would be glad to do it, to try to, say what I've been saying here to people that might be able to do something about it. But I actually really paused on that one. I felt like, given the threats to annex Canada that were being repeated daily, I really, questioned whether I should even set foot there. But I decided to do it, and I actually wrote up comments and presented it to them, explaining how I think the United States is putting itself in danger. And when I finished, one of staffers for a senator on that committee said you should publish them. And I hadn't actually thought about doing it, so I published it in the Globe and Mail for those who are interested. I think last week it came out.
And the main message?
The main message I was trying to convey to that committee was, look, you are in charge of intelligence, and what we are seeing is the United States actually doing things that are self-defeating, that are ultimately going to create huge insecurities for the United States itself. For example, threatening to annex Canada. How can a country like Canada cooperate on intelligence sharing, cooperate on fighting terrorism, cooperate on controlling these horrible spyware tools with a country like the United States when they're now our greatest existential risk? Yeah. Like that is ultimately going to harm the United States itself. That's what I was trying to tell that particular committee, that, look, if you have a job to do exposing abuse of power, and you've done it in the past, that committee has been responsible. It's not just a rubber stamp committee all the time. There have been periods in history when they have exposed important abuses of power, and I was trying to encourage them to do it. But getting back to what's going on, I'm actually not all that surprised. There's that famous quote from Maya Angelou: when people tell you who they are, believe them. They've all been telling us this for many, many years, and here we are. That doesn't make it any more pleasant, though. We're seeing routine attacks on the media, on democratic institutions, corruption, just straight out, unashamed, venal corruption. Is unbelievable to see that sort of thing going on, and cruelty, just cruelty, and of course bullying behavior. So it's a nightmare. It's really horrible to see this happening, and for a group like ours, it's a game changer. Multiple levels. Like we just outed this firm Paragon, which I talked about already. They have a U.S. office, and the people who make up that company's executives are all former CIA people. At some point, somebody down there might decide to target a group like us. Yeah. They're already going after universities in a pretty wholesale way in the United States. So what would that look like? That's the discussion that I'm having with my colleagues now. How do we factor in this new threat actor? It happens to be the world's superpower. Mm-hmm. Right?
There's another threat that I want to address before I finish here, and that is the one that you deal with on a regular basis. In your book, you constantly remind us of the degree to which your own life has kind of been upended by the work that you do, and how hard it must be to just be like a normal person. So, for example, you write, after I check in at a hotel, I assume the room may be bugged. So I find an excuse to request a change to a different room. I use the hotel only to sleep and shower. It's hard not to think about what that must do to you in the long run, and I'm just wondering whether that you think is a sustainable way of living.
It is for me, and I think it is for my colleagues, because we're all in this together, and the staff enters into this with eyes wide open. And getting back to the Guatemala chapter that you asked about in the beginning, when you start dealing with people who are real victims, I've got it easy, actually, compared to someone like Loujain Al-Hatul or Ahmad Mansour. And you develop a camaraderie, a kinship, and it's part of the bargain. To do this, you have to do it, and you have to take it seriously. And it's one of the things I'm really proud of our team, is how seriously we take those risks. We don't do anything frivolously or in a cavalier way. We try to think it through as best we can. And the reason is not so much to protect me or each other as it is to protect the victims and the subjects of our research. the last thing I want to do is inadvertently cause harm to somebody that I'm researching. And that's how we kind of structure everything we do.
The book ends on a hopeful note. It says, you say, with the world in such turmoil, it's easy to overlook the progress against cyber espionage that we have made. After years toiling alone, the Citizen Lab is now part of a growing community that is conducting the type of digital accountability investigations that we pioneered. A less optimistic person might say, you've strengthened the defenses, but now there's a tsunami coming at us. Mm-hmm. Just a final thought of what's the answer to that?
It's not easy. You could say the same remark about tsunami with respect to social media even. It's slightly less consequential than the authoritarianism we're seeing, but that's a tsunami of a different sort, and we're all experiencing that. And I think what I've seen is when we started doing this research on targeted espionage, we were really alone. For like 10 years we were doing this. I would say apart from journalists that we worked with, who are extremely important, both as telling the stories, but also working with us directly on the research. But then over time, other organizations started doing what we do. Amnesty International has Security Lab, which is modeled to some degree on the Citizen Lab, and they do very similar research to us. Access Now, this NGO that has a 24/7 digital security helpline. It feels really good to be part of a community. And I think that's a good model. I think if we all stand up to bullies and collaborate, cooperate on local levels, the way I think about what we do is local to the topic. It's possible. Otherwise, what's the alternative? Do we just give up? Do we go hide in a hole somewhere? I don't want to do that. Then you're letting the bullies win. And I'm fortunate to have a platform to be able to do what we do. So as long as I'm breathing, that's what I'm going to do.
Ron, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nahlah. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.